Okay, on to lecture 2 of 8. This one will be on mind and society. And we're going to talk about some pretty awful things. I think that's just going to be the rest of the semester, just awful thing after awful thing. Awful thing number 1, lobotomies. Awful thing number 2, opioid crisis. I don't know if the third one's really, well, yeah, it's awful thing number 3, the war on drugs, and then maybe some lessons to take from this as we go forward with our discussion of health. So the connection between bioethics that we've gone through already and lobotomies, the opioid crisis, the war on drugs, and the impact that it's had on society should be obvious, but if it's not, I'll try to mention it as it comes up. So in the early 20th century, there were things called shock therapies. Right? There's insulin shock therapy, convulsive therapy to try to induce seizures. It's different from electroconvulsive therapy, which used electricity. Deep sleep therapy to try to keep patients asleep for days or weeks. The idea was to treat all sorts of mental illnesses with these. We still use electroconvulsive therapy. A lot of these therapies fell out of use and we developed better drugs. One thing you never want to be if you go back in time at any point in history is a non-dominant group. But another thing is a non-dominant group member that is thought to be, I guess they'd use the term insane or crazy or bewitched or something. Mental health. People suffered, and usually they suffered alone or they were thrown into really horrible conditions. Last year, for fun, I read the book 10 Days in a Madhouse by Millie Bly, and you know, it was bad. It seems like it might still be bad. I haven't read any new updates on that, but we treated people we thought were mentally ill horribly. So we developed shock therapies, and we use these to treat all sorts of ailments. The one that's going to matter here is post-traumatic stress disorder, which would have been called shell shock at the time. And before I get into that, I need to talk about the lobotomy. So Antonio Moniz in 1935 witnesses a lecture where these scientists are reporting that they had removed the frontal lobe from a chimpanzee, and this ordinary mean chimpanzee had become nicer. Moniz raises the question about whether we could do this for humans as well, and everybody in the room is extremely shocked. By the way, he was not a time traveler. 1874 is what this should say. He was what? I'm going to fix it before I forget. Live. We'll do it live. He raised the question, and the presenters were shocked that anybody would suggest to do that to humans. Nevertheless, Moniz wins a Nobel Prize for this. And then it comes to the Americas, to the United States. Walter Freeman reads about Moniz's discovery of and results from having drilled into the head and taken cores out of the brain, right? Moniz didn't remove entire lobes of the brain. It would have been called a lobectomy. But they would drill into the head and take out tubular cylinders of brain material. Monique specifically did this with patients that were mentally ill, that had not responded to other treatment. Freeman thought that you should just go further, and began writing several books with a collaborator to try to bring lobotomies to the United States. He recruited James Watts as a surgeon, and they wrote a couple of books. They began treating patients with pretty much any disease, not just diseases that sent them to mental institutions. They operated on a variety of patients, and the patients tended to come out with a placid expression. They tended to be less anxious and less apprehensive, just genuinely duller. This was considered a success. Magazines reported this far and wide, that medical science had finally cured mental ailments. But this wasn't enough for Walter Freeman. He thought that a 6-hour lobotomy was too much. And so he went to work with cadavers on his own. Keep in mind, he's not a surgeon. And with one cadaver, he finds a way to slip the object that was nearest to him, which happened to be an ice pick, literally just a sharp stabbing thing to break up ice. He found that it was possible in cadavers to slide it between the eye and the nose into the brain, wiggle it around for a couple of minutes, and then remove it. He thought that it was completely doable, and in 1946, again, pay attention to the timeline, this is right after World War II, he performs his first lobotomy in a non-sterilized room in his office, right, not a surgical theater, with a patient, a housewife. James Watts finds this and instantly dissolves their partnership. There are some videos you can find of interviews with lobotomized patients that survived. About a third improved, about a third noticed no effect, and about a third degenerated in some way. Many patients died. Among the patients treated by James Freeman was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of John F. Kennedy. Their father thought that she was too rebellious, and without the consent of her or her mother or anybody else, took her to see this doctor, and the doctor lobotomized her, and she was never the same again. John F. Kennedy saw her once while he was president. He went to visit her in a mental institution, but several other of her siblings never visited her again. It turns out, jabbing an ice pick and wiggling it in your brain is bad. Freeman thought that he was reverting patients to a childlike state of wonder, and he would brag about how other doctors were unable to deal with watching him perform his operations, so-called operations. He would do them with his eyes closed, with both hands, posing for pictures. People died when he was posing for pictures. There's a famous image of him posing while he's performing a lobotomy, and the patient dies because he wasn't paying enough attention. Apparently, the idea that he called his band the Lobotomobile is just is not true. But he did perform several thousand lobotomies in nearly half of the states, mostly using his technique. Many of his patients were gay. Many of his patients were women. He operated on children, and he had many repeat patients. This was very, very popular for a long time. Um, and even though patients began organizing against him, uh, it didn't really end his career, which went on for a better part of a decade, until thorazine, this chemical lobotomy, this drug, entered the market. Doctors preferred prescribing it over lobotomies. So Freeman's not the only one that conducted lobotomies. He had seminars teaching other doctors to perform lobotomies. But as he, over the next couple of decades, after thorazine was introduced, um, people began to view lobotomies as more risky than they were worth. And Freeman kept trying to save his reputation. He wanted to be more famous than his grandfather, as the book shows. He eventually loses his license. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And we'll get started with the opioid crisis in the next one.